It's hard to believe that it's been 20 years. I remember exactly where I was. I was in synagogue, in fact, right here in Los Angeles, the moment I heard the news that Prime Minister Yitzchak Rabin had been shot. And later that day, we found out that he had died. I always felt a special connection with Rabin, one that really began when I first moved to Israel as a rabbinical student in 1992. It was an election year, and Rabin was running on the labor ticket. I fell in love with Rabin's voice, and here's why. As someone who was just learning Hebrew, I loved how slowly he spoke. I could understand almost every word he said, slow and steady, almost plodding. I loved whenever he came on the radio. And I remember watching the election results in a little pub on Emek Rephaim with some friends. I remember cheering when Yitzchak Rabin gave his victory speech from the Labor Party headquarters. He had won, and I understood his acceptance speech, and so I was happy. A few years later, right here in Los Angeles, I had the opportunity to meet Yitzchak Rabin. It was an amazing moment for me. I was nervous. I was trembling when I shook his hand, and I said to him softly, "Ata gibor, you are a hero." He gave me sort of an odd look and said, "Toda rabba." Yitzchak Rabin, his name didn't really suit him. He was, after all, described by even close friends as a serious, almost humorless man. Perhaps, however, there's another dimension of this name, of this word Yitzchak, that applies to our Gibor, this fallen hero that we remember 20 years later. In this week's Torah portion, Vayera, we read about the birth, the circumcision, and the naming of the biblical Yitzchak. And then in chapter 21, verse 6, Sarah plays with the name of this newborn child, this child she's waited her whole life for. Tzchok asali Elohim, kol hashomea Yitzchak li. God has given me laughter. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. But what exactly is the nature of this tzchok, this laughter? The commentators help us understand this key word of this week's Torah portion. The Rashbam understands it as a laugh of amazement, sort of a, who would have possibly imagined? I can't believe it sort of laugh. A 90-year-old woman giving birth. Onkelos, who translated the Torah to Aramaic, understands it differently. He understands tzchok as chedva, as joy, simcha. That's why she laughs. She's so happy. And Rashi understands it more expansively. He says, Rav tzchok haya ba'olam. He's called Yitzchak because his birth made the whole world filled with joy. And the Torah actually really supports this idea of Rashi's, because just a few verses later, it says that they have a great party for Yitzchak, a mishteh, which is a drinking festival. People would gather and celebrate and raise a l'chaim. But they call it a mishteh gadol, a great party. And the commentators tell us it's called a great party, gadol, mishteh gadol, because all of the gadolei hador, all of the great people, all of the great men and women, the leaders of the world at that time, came to celebrate the birth of Yitzchak out of honor and kavod for Sarah and Avraham. So Yitzchak is the one who brings joy to the world. He's a catalyst, and he is a vehicle for laughter and joy. He himself, though, is not necessarily a joyful person. And we know from this week's Torah portion as well, he goes through a terrible trauma when his father binds him and almost sacrifices him. Though different in very important ways, Yitzchak ben Avraham v'Sarah, the biblical Isaac, and Yitzchak ben Nehemiah v'Rosa, Yitzchak Rabin, were really quite similar. Both of them were born in Israel. Yitzchak Rabin was born in Sha'arei Tzedek Hospital in 1922. Both were farmers. As a young man, Rabin went to agricultural school in the Galilee, where he won the High Commissioner's Gold Medal as the best student in what was then called Palestine. But most strikingly, the world actually did indeed experience joy and gladness because of each one of them. Yitzchak Rabin, the heroic peacemaker, he brought hope, simcha in a very real sense, to so many, to Jews and to Arabs and to the nations of the world. But he himself like the biblical Yitzchak, knew little peace. He knew little laughter. He toiled tirelessly on behalf of his people. Every soldier wounded or killed under his command was like a fallen son. And his face and his voice carried the memories of these other korbanot, these other sacrifices. The end of this week's parashah is Akedat Yitzchak, as I mentioned before, the binding of Isaac. And there's this terrible moment when Abraham raises a knife above his own child's head. And in the Midrash, the rabbinical commentaries on the parashah, the rabbis imagine an amazing ending to the story. When the angel cries out, according to the Midrash, and tells Abraham not to sacrifice his son, the angel is so moved by Abraham's faith and so pained by Isaac's turmoil that the angel begins to cry. And according to the Midrash, one of the tears drops from the angel's eye and lands on the knife. It's a very cinematic moment, pre-cinema. And when the tear lands on the knife, it melts the knife, rendering it useless. It's this beautiful, beautiful image. And we imagine if only our tears could save us at this moment in our lives as Jews, as lovers of Zion over the past few weeks, and indeed over the past many decades. We have shed so many tears because of the loss of so many who have made the ultimate sacrifice for the Jewish state and the Jewish people. And as much as we'd like to maintain our hope, and as much as we'd like to believe that Yitzchak Rabin's legacy is one of doing the difficult work of making peace with our enemies, we find ourselves at moments like this almost without hope at all. How can we imagine peace with our neighbors when we're afraid that our neighbors, literally the neighbors living right across the street, might stab us? And how can we pray for angelic tears to save us when our eyes are filled with tears of mourning for men and women who've been murdered in cold blood on the streets of Jerusalem and Kfar Saba and Tel Aviv? Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav famously taught, though, that it's forbidden to give up hope. And he taught that the whole world is a narrow bridge, yes, kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar me'od, but the ikar, the important thing, lo lefached, is not to be afraid. But fear makes hope harder. Fear makes hope seem almost impossible. But it's still there. It's there. It's in our prayer book. It's in our tradition. It's in our Torah. It's in the lives also of our heroes. Yitzchak Rabin knew what it was to be afraid. He fought in many wars. He sent men into battle, and he was there at their funerals. And he knew how difficult and dangerous the road to peace might be. And in perhaps his most courageous act, the one that ultimately motivated his killer, Rabin chose hope over fear. And he chose peace over war. His choice can inspire our choices. He knew about fear, we can be sure of that, but he chose hope. You might have read this week about the death of Richard Lakin, a native of Connecticut who made Aliyah to Israel some 30 years ago. He was active in the civil rights movement in America, and he worked for coexistence between Jews and Arabs in Israel, and he was active in Kehilat Kol HaNeshama in Jerusalem and other Reform synagogues in the area. Before making Aliyah, he was principal of an elementary school in Glastonbury, Connecticut, and he was active in his Jewish community there, and he wrote a book called Teaching as an Act of Love. And in the introduction to the book, he writes that love is the basis of all authentic teaching. Love is the basis of all authentic teaching. After making Aliyah, Richard continued his work as an educator, teaching English to Jewish and Arab students in Jerusalem. And 2 weeks ago in Armon HaNatziv, a neighborhood in Jerusalem that I used to jog through when I lived there, Richard was stabbed by two teenage boys from a neighboring village. boys just like the ones he taught English to over the decades. And just the other day, he died of his wounds. His death is tragic and it's awful, but his life was inspiring and exalted. His life was about love and tolerance and kavod for the other. His death breaks our hearts, but we cannot let it destroy our hope. Richard knew how complicated and painful and difficult the situation in Israel is. He knew it better than we do. He lived there for 30 years, right on the seam, in a neighborhood that borders a Palestinian village. He lived through 2 intifadas and numerous wars, but he never gave up hope. He refused to believe that peace was not possible. Hard? Yes. Distant? Certainly. But impossible? Never. Teaching is an act of love, and it's an act of hope, and it's an act of faith. Just as children can be taught to hate, we have to believe that they can be taught to love. Just as they can be taught to fear the other, they can be taught that, as we're teaching our children as our school theme this year, ha'acher hu ani, the other is me. In the face of stabbings and terror, we mourn, and we demand our right to vigorously defend ourselves. And as Jews, as descendants of Abraham and Yitzchak, as descendants of the Yitzchak whose death we mourn this Shabbat, as family of Richard Lakin and others who have been brutally murdered by those who have been taught to hate, we refuse to give up hope, and we will not teach hate to our children. We refuse to believe that peace is an illusion, an impossibility. Od lo avda tikvatenu. We sing it every time we sing the words of Hatikva. We have not, and we will not lose our hope. Shabbat Shalom.